And actually, I'd like to challenge the Christian polemicists to provide an example of a classical Muslim scholar that held the view that the Torah is fully preserved. Oh, and I'm kind enough to let you know that I'm familiar with the types of statements that you're going to bring to argue that classical Muslim scholars believed in the preservation of the Old Testament and New Testament. But yeah, go for it. Let's see what happens. Folks, when I put out a challenge and I tell you that I know what you're going to bring, you should be a little careful in how you approach it. In response to my challenge, three Christian apologists came together and put out a 2-hour and 40-minute video attempting to take up my challenge. And then they had the audacity to claim that my career was over. First of all, this isn't my career. I don't even have monetization on. Apologetics would be David Wood's career, but putting out videos and making you guys look foolish, that's more of a hobby. Did you seriously think that this is over?
You asked me excellent question.
What is the overall kind of view of or different views of the classical scholars?
I did want to point out something because we skip over Muhammad and say, oh, he's challenging us about scholars and so on. Yeah. I actually don't like letting guys like Fareed sidestep the issue of, wait a minute, your God and your prophet say in some of the clearest statements in the Quran and Hadith that Jews and Christians still have the Torah and the gospel. And
David, there's a very good reason why I ask you guys to present examples of scholars that agree with your position. You, David, claim that Muslim scholars today and du'at, they realize what's in the Bible. And due to this, they have to reinterpret the Quran in order to defend Islam. And you also claim that early Muslim scholars took the Quran at face value, they didn't know what was in the Bible, and therefore they accepted that the Old and New Testament are preserved.
Dude, the early position of your scholars was that the Quran affirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. Eventually, Muslims found out what's in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, and they figured out, this doesn't line up with Islam at all. What's going on here? Which should have been a good indication we've been following a false prophet, but they couldn't because that would get your head chopped off in the caliphate. So what do you have to do? Well, the Quran affirms these scriptures, but the Quran contradicts these scriptures. So that means it's either false, which we can't say because then I got a head chopped off, or we'll just say the Bible's been corrupted. And then they start saying that. And then they start marginalizing the earlier positions.
The first question I want to ask is, when did the Muslims first become aware of what is in the scriptures of the Jews and Christians?
And what I found really interesting as well is that according to most recent scholarship, and I found Muslim scholars agreeing that this is the direction that recent scholarship is taking on this issue, is that there isn't the understanding that the Injil and the Torah are corrupt, generally speaking, textually, until the 11th century. We don't see that until then. It seems to have originated with someone called Ibn Hazm.
So Ibn Hazm passed away 450 years after the Prophet, peace be upon him. So we shouldn't have any trouble finding tens of scholars that affirm this. But what is interesting is these guys spent 2 hours and 40 minutes, and this is what they were able to come up with.
Again, that's 11th century. Prior to that, scholars like Mutakal Ibn Sulaiman, Ibn Ashaq, the first biographer of Muhammad's life, they choose to interpret it more through Tarif al-Mana, or corruption of interpretation, corruption of the meaning, not corruption of the text. There are other scholars as well that seem to make it very clear that they don't think that it's been textually corrupted. The reason we can tell this is quite simple. It's because when it comes to verses like Surah 7, Ayah 157, that talks about Muhammad being written in the books they have with them of the Injil and the Torah, guess what? They actually try and translate the, like, for example, Matthew's Gospel, the same Matthew's Gospel that we have today. They try and translate it into Arabic, at least like the first 8 chapters. And they do it for the purpose of trying to back up the claim in the Quran that Muhammad is referenced.
It's a very strange claim to make because simply quoting the Bible does not mean that you believe that it's valid or that it's preserved. There's this genre called Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the Bible. I don't know if you guys have come across that. Now, you don't have to believe in that, but the du'at and the scholars that are quoting examples from the Bible, verses from the Bible, they don't believe that it's preserved, but they still believe in those specific verses. So if you want to argue that Muqatil believed in the Bible, what you need to do is you need to provide an explicit claim by Muqatil.
So that's the issue for me. So Fareed's like, oh, well, what about later scholars after they've realized that we've got this huge problem? Why don't they say this? Well, you do have some. So I'm just going to quote Abdullah Saeed here. Quick quote.
Okay.
This is Dr. Abdullah Saeed, professor of Arab and Islamic studies at the University of Melbourne. And I mentioned that, yeah, your average Muslim is going to tell you, no, your scriptures have been corrupted. You do have exceptions. And you do have exceptions at the scholarly level. So this is a quote from him in his essay, his journal article, "The Charge of Corruption of Jewish and Christian Scriptures." This is towards the end. Part of his conclusion, he says, since the authorized scriptures of Jews and Christians remain very much today as they existed at the time of the prophet, it is difficult to argue that the Quranic references to the Torah and the gospel were only to the pure Torah and gospel as existed at the time of Moses and Jesus, respectively. So notice what he says. If the scriptures we have now are basically the same as what we had during the time of Muhammad, it's difficult to argue that what the Quran is talking about is only some pure, original, unadulterated form back at the time of Moses and Jesus. He goes on, if the texts have remained more or less as they were in the 7th century, the reverence the Quran has shown them, his work, he says the Quran shows reverence to these scriptures that existed during the time of Muhammad. If the texts have remained more or less as they were in the 7th century CE, the reverence the Quran has shown them at the time should be retained even today. Many interpreters of the Quran, from Tabari to Razi to Ibn Taymiyyah and even Qutb, appear to be inclined to share this view. The wholesale dismissive attitude held by many Muslims in the modern period towards the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity do not seem to have the support of either the Quran or the major figures of tafsir. So he's actually flipping it. He's saying...
Now, I'm not sure if David actually read the paper that he's quoting because the author provides quotes from these previous scholars that suggest some types of distortion occurring in the Old and New Testament. Take, for example, the statement from At-Tabari. Abdullah Saeed states that At-Tabari believed that tahrif was done during the time of Moses. David didn't bother to show his audience these quotes or any quotes to substantiate his claim, because none of these scholars say anything explicit about the Old and New Testament being preserved. By the way, I recommend Bassam Zawadi's article on the subject for more on At-Tabari and his view of the corruption of the Bible. He also has a section on Al-Razi that includes explicit quotes like this one, in which he affirms both corruption in interpretation and the text as well. He also has a section on Ibn Taymiyyah with a couple of quotes denying the authority of the 4 Gospels and also affirming the corruption of the Torah. Link to the article will be added to the description.
And he says also this is the school of thought of Al-Bukhari. So the compiler of Sahih al-Bukhari, this was his view according to Ibn al-Qayyim. He had the position that the Torah is fully preserved and that the only corruption that took place is not in the text, but actually it's in the interpretation of the people, the Jews and the Christians. Okay, that's one of the scholars he mentions. And then he quotes Al-Bukhari now, and he says in his Sahih that they corrupt/change means they removed, and he says no one can remove the wording of a book from the books of Allah, rather they corrupt it, meaning they interpret it according to other than its true interpretation. So that's Al-Bukhari. So he's asking, give me a scholar. Well, okay, how's Al-Bukhari? Is that a good one for you, Fareed?
So let me provide a bit of context. In this chapter, Al-Bukhari mentions a few words from the Quran, then provides definitions. Now, just by looking at this information, you'd think that only one sentence here is attributed to Ibn Abbas, and that the rest are definitions by al-Bukhari. However, upon returning to other works of tafsir, we come to realize that these statements are not by al-Bukhari. They're actually attributions to Ibn Abbas, with the exception of the middle part here in green, which we cannot find in any source. Due to this, Ibn Hajar points out that this section in green may be by al-Bukhari, but it also may be by Ibn Abbas. I mean, since it is within a section of his quotes. Now, even though Ibn Qayyim did believe that this is al-Bukhari speaking in this section, however, anyone who just reads it can come to either or conclusion. And many people just read this and just simply assume that this is Ibn Abbas talking and not al-Bukhari. Like these guys, the Christian apologists themselves.
In regard to this specific verse that you brought up, so Ibn Abbas makes he said something. So I think I have it on the screen. Already good. So it's on the screen. So what it says, right? So who distort the book with their tongues means they alter them, right? Allah's words. Now, al-Bukhari reported that Ibn Abbas said that the ayah means they alter and add, although none among Allah's creation can remove the words of Allah from his books, plural.
Al-Bukhari reported that Ibn Abbas said that the ayah means they alter and add, although none among Allah's creation can remove the words of Allah from his books, they alter and distort their apparent meanings. Let me repeat what Bukhari said. Bukhari's quoting Ibn Abbas again one more time.
No, in fact, that would contradict. And Fareed, we can go into more detail on this. Ibn Abbas believed in that the earlier scriptures had been preserved.
Oh, and by the way, I thought this clip was quite amusing.
He quotes al-Bukhari now, and he says in his Sahih that they corrupt / change means they removed, and he says no one can remove the wording of a book from the books of Allah, rather they corrupt it, meaning they interpret it according to other than its true interpretation. So that's al-Bukhari. So he's asking, give me a scholar. Well, okay. How's al-Bukhari? Is that a good one for you, Fareed?
David here actually knows that him and his buddies often attribute it to Ibn Abbas instead of al-Bukhari, but he doesn't want to ruin the argument, so he decided to stay quiet. But why would David be quiet? Isn't the attribution to Ibn Abbas a stronger argument against Islam? No, it's not, because it's a weak attribution to Ibn Abbas. But do you know where to find an actual isnad, an authentic chain to Ibn Abbas? It's in Sahih al-Bukhari, guys. So just to make it clear, al-Bukhari provides two quotes from Ibn Abbas. One has an actual chain and one has no chain. The one with a chain falls under the conditions of al-Bukhari, an authentic hadith with narrators that are reliable. The one without a chain, that does not fall under al-Bukhari's conditions. Therefore, we accept the one that falls under his conditions, not the one with no source. I can imagine some Muslims in the comments typing out, but Fareed, you really think that David Wood actually knows these things? Aren't you giving him a bit too much credit? Actually, it's very possible that you're right, and it's possible that David's just agreeing with everything, not knowing what the heck's going on, even though the same exact quote is being attributed to different people. It's possible. To conclude, you got 3 Christian apologists, 2 hours, 40 minutes, together on stream, trying to provide a single example of a classical Muslim scholar that affirms that the Bible is preserved, and they're simply unable to. Well, what does this mean? Again, it means that the classical Muslim scholars that took the Quran at face value understood the Quran in the same way that modern Muslims do today. For some reason, it's the Christian apologists that are reading into the Quran in a different way and coming to a conclusion that their scriptures are preserved. They're unable to prove their scriptures historically, so they gotta do it with Muslims through a theological argument. Now, before ending this video, David, I got a piece of advice for you. Watch my videos, because you keep making the same dumb points that I've refuted in the past. And I know that when you're recommended one of my videos, it gives you a bit of anxiety and you don't want to click on that thumbnail. I understand that. But if you don't watch my videos, you're not going to be able to grow. And I can't help but be condescending to you. I mean, what do you expect? You want me to treat you like an equal? Come on. And to the rest of you guys, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Man, we got issues.
Serious issues, man. Serious issues on a level that's unimaginable, man. Seriously, I know that about myself. Yeah. So
Here's what's funny, right? I mean, I am an actual ex-mental patient, and Sam should be an ex-mental patient, right?
Yeah.
I mean.